In procurement and supply chain, you make a lot of decisions regarding sourcing activities to external suppliers. Of course, these decisions are summed up in contracts, but you still have to worry about the relationship with the suppliers. Now, the CIPS Level 4 Module 6, that is Supplier Relationships, is designed for those with responsibility for managing relationships with suppliers and other stakeholders, and those with responsibility for establishing and developing formal partnership relationships. Now, that module, the module has 3 parts, which means that on a larger, in a broader sense, you're supposed to be in a position to understand the dynamics of relationships in supply chains, understand process and procedures for successful working with stakeholders, as well as understand the concept of partnering. Now we're going to do summary videos for all of those, all of those parts. This being the first, which means if you haven't subscribed, kindly do and hit the notification bell. Now regarding the first part, remember I said there are 3 parts. So regarding the first part, that is understanding the dynamics of relationships in supply chain, there are 4 learning outcomes, which means that by the time you're done, you should be in a position to differentiate between different types of commercial relationships in supply chains, appraise portfolio analysis techniques to assess relationships in supply chains, identify the competitive forces that impact on relationship in supply chains, as well as compare the sources of added value that can be achieved through supply chain relationship. Okay, so let's get started. Let's look at the first learning outcome and see what is what. Differentiate between different types of commercial relationships in supply chain. That is the first learning outcome. And the procurement and the supplier department, or the buyer and the seller, are going to have different kinds of relationships depending on the circumstance or the context they exist in. The buyer needs to consider what the optimum type of relationship might be for each part of the supply chain and put strategies in place to achieve these. And that is the reason why you need to understand who are the internal and who are the external suppliers. So speaking of internal and external suppliers, it is common to assume that when you're talking about suppliers, then we're just dealing with external, We're dealing with external suppliers. But, that's not the case. So who are the internal suppliers? Let's start with internal suppliers. Internal suppliers are also known as in-house suppliers, It is a supplier that is part of the same company as its customers. It provides the product or service that co-workers within the organization need in order to do their jobs. And so the question of the issue of internal suppliers just come down to the make or buy decision. Do we make this thing or do we buy it from someone else? And so if we decide to make it, then that means internal, Imagine you have an educational business. In this case, let's call it the Right Network. Let's call it ABC Limited, Since you're very good at coming up with names, alright? So ABC Limited, which is an educational business. So ABC is in need of some videos to promote their products. In this case, CIPS practice exercise, video lessons, PDF study guides, which by the way you can just find on the zeritnetwork.com, So just there, you'll find all that stuff. So the company has a decision to make. Do they go with an outside company for this job? Or do they just do it in-house, Go with an in-house team. So if the company decides that we are not going to have someone else from outside to help us develop promotional material for this purpose, we're just going to do it with our IT team or with our marketing team or whatever it is, then that company, in this case, has decided to go with internal suppliers. So what are the advantages of doing this? What are the advantages associated with going with internal suppliers? And in this case, you're looking at things like greater control and continuity of supply. You're not exactly depending on external suppliers here, which means you're not going to be dealing with issues of we couldn't produce because of 1, 2, 3. I mean, you're doing it internally and therefore you can control the process. And you're sure if things are there, they're there. Number 2, you can improve the quality of what you're working on since you have control over the manufacturing process. 3, you get to control the production cost by eliminating margins introduced by suppliers. Also, since the supplier and the customers are part of the same organization, the relationship between the two is likely to be stable. And finally, it is easy to protect your intellectual property if you're dealing with one. So you also have to remember that not everything is going to be done internally. But when it comes to core products, okay, things that you'd rather not worry about, then yeah, it's a good idea to do that internally. So here's a question for you, learning by doing. What are the disadvantages of using internal suppliers? Yep, think about that. Now, to sum it up, just remember that it's not always going to be possible for an organization to produce stuff internally, okay? And the reason for this could include things like high cost associated with producing the volume required, legal reasons like permits and licenses, or even skills needed, okay? And so, yeah, that's pretty much one of those reasons that explain why you may have to decide on the buy, okay? So in a make or buy decision, you're like, let's buy, let's not make. Right, so let's move on. External suppliers. Now, external supplier is a supplier that is independent from the organization and provides product or services to it. So remember the example that you're using, the ABC Limited, and the fact that they need another team to help them with their educational, or rather developing promotional material for their educational products, okay? So if the company decides that, you know what, you're not going to do this thing internally, you're going to have another company do it for us. You're going to, hire an outside company to do that. So that outside company becomes an external supplier. The selection of an external supplier will depend on factors like purchase price, delivery lead time, quality of product or service, the previous experience of the supplier. And when it comes to doing this, or rather when it comes to this entire process, as a procurement professional, there are three things, okay? There are three core things which you're going to be doing. And these are selecting, having contract with, and managing external suppliers. So when deciding on whether to go with or whether not to go with external suppliers, you also have to look at the supply chain risks involved. And in this case, we're talking about things like supplier insolvency, delivery delays, natural disaster, political instability, etc. Now, what are the advantages? Okay, what are the advantages of working with external suppliers? And remember, these advantages usually just tend to be disadvantages that are going to be attributed to working with internal suppliers. So what are these advantages? Okay, well, we have things like the supplier is an expert on their field. Number two, since the supplier can gain economies of scale when buying raw materials, since this is their field, that can help in reducing the overall cost the buyer incurs. Number three, it frees up the organization to use internal resources on other things. Now, if there are advantages, it means there are disadvantages. And in this case, the disadvantages will include things like, depending on what is being produced, there could be a dependency on the supplier, and that can be risky. Of course, if the supplier does something unethical, this will affect the business's reputation. Also, there is a cost associated with the transportation of whatever it is that is being supplied. So you can add more to that list. And I just want to remind you that in the description area, okay, I've added a lot of resources that can help you, with all of these. And you can also just go to zerightnetwork.com and check out, okay, the PDF downloads, video lessons, practice exercises on whatever it is that you are interested in. So check that out. Now let's talk about the relationship spectrum. And when you're managing relationship with the suppliers, okay, now the first thing you want to do is establish exactly the nature, okay, or the kind of relationship that you actually have. This way, you know where you need to put in more effort and where not to waste a lot of effort. The supplier relationship spectrum will help you with this. The spectrum ranges from adversarial relationship through to collaborative co-destiny relationship. And depending on factors like duration, trust, communication, and problem solving, as well as how the relationship moves from adversarial all the way to collaborative, you can tell what kind of relationship you actually have. So adversarial, arm's length, transactional, closer tactical, single sourced, outsourced, strategic alliance partnership, and core destiny are the sort of 9 relationships. Are the 9 relationships that are going to be, that you're going to arrive at when you look at that relationship spectrum. Okay, so there are 9 in this case, varying from adversarial all the way to collaborative. So in between there, depending on all those traits we've mentioned, you end up with those 9 relationships. And the thing you have to understand is that each of these relationships has its own trait, okay, which will depend. And those traits, or rather the nature of that relationship, will also determine the kind of strategy you can come up with when you're dealing with supplier. So for example, in adversarial relationship, the outcome is more important than the relationship. Think of it this way. If you are more keen on the price of whatever it is that you're about to buy, and you don't really care about developing a long-term relationship with that partner, then of course, the kind of relationship you are having in this case is adversarial. Now, what does that mean? It means you are not really going to be like negotiating in that case so that you can have a long-term contract. Nope, you just want this one-off purchase and then you move on. You see, that is adversarial relationship. Now, compare that to something like co-destiny kind of relationship, which is very much based on collaboration. In fact, in this case, the buyer organization and the supplier organization will be closely linked. Okay, and that is what you see in the joint ventures sort of relationship. So the extreme end, adversarial, you don't really care about that relationship with the supplier. The extreme end, okay, when you're moving towards, collaboration, so we have co-destiny. In this case, you really want to work together, so you end up having a joint venture. And in between, you still have more. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to summarize all that in a PDF, okay, and I'm going to add it in the resource area, so you're going to be in a position to access that. And so here's a practical thing, okay. If you work in an organization or are associated with one, think about the supplier relationships and see where they fit in the relationship spectrum. Meaning what? Look at those relationships and decide, is it adversarial? Is it single source? Is it co-destiny? Is it, all that stuff. So that's just a practical question, okay? So think about that and come up with that answer. And now let's go over the relationship life cycle. And all relationships will change. They will evolve and they will change over time. And the same can be said about the buyer-supplier relationship. A new supplier will be onboarded and the other supplier relationship will be terminated. And so a typical supplier relationship will look something like this. So in this case, we have onboarding, and then there is qualification of suppliers, then segmentation and risk management, after which there is performance management, and then development and innovation and phase out if required. Okay, so now let's go over the things that actually happen in those stages. And the first one is qualification. And this stage usually starts with the buyer looking for a suitable supplier. Of course, a suitable supplier will just depend on whatever it is that the buyer needs. So the buyer requirements are going to determine who is a suitable supplier. And these needs can be expressed on a request for information or a request for proposal, so RFI or RFP. And when the supplier is actually appraised, or rather when the buyer is appraising suppliers, one of the things that they can use, or rather one of the techniques that they can use, is the tray cutters. Okay, so cutters 10 C's. This is something that can help them. And these 10 C's, like 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10, are things like competency, capacity, commitment to quality, control process, cash, cost, consistency, culture, clean, and communication. And yes, I'm going to sum up those in a PDF and put it in the resources. Now, once that is done, okay, they've looked at all those 10 things. Then the next thing they're going to look out, or rather the next thing that is going to happen in this stage is segmentation. So segmentation and risk management. So this stage will involve segmenting whatever it is that you're buying our products, okay, and the suppliers that are supplying those ones. That way, we can understand, okay, we can know whatever risk is involved. Like if somebody is supplying critical items, then the way you're dealing with that supplier is not the same way you're going to be dealing with a supplier who's just supplying routine items that you can get anywhere else. So that is the reason why segmentation is important. Risk management, which is a process involving risk identification, assessment, and management, will also be undertaken in this stage. I mean, for the reasons that we've just mentioned, okay? Which products are we dealing with, and what are the risks involved if that supply chain is interrupted, okay, or if that supply is interrupted. And the other thing that follows will be performance management. And in this stage, you're just trying to appraise the current performance of the supplier. This may be assessed against the required standards, the supplier's previous performance, and how it compares to other suppliers delivering a similar service. And that is why you're going to have KPIs, the key performance indicators. So you're not just dealing with suppliers, you need to know that, okay, so these are the key indicators or key performance indicators that you're going to be appraising against. So some of those things could include things like some of the KPIs, things like safety, quality, delivery cost, morale, as well as environment. As part of learning by doing, here's a question for you. Pick any two of the following KPIs and state what you'll be looking for when appraising suppliers' current performance. So in this case, safety, quality, delivery, cost, morale, and environment. So if you are appraising, okay, any of those two in terms of performance, exactly what are you going to be looking at? So think about that and let's move on to the next stage. Now, development and innovation is the next stage. Supplier development is the process of working with a supplier to improve its process as well as the product or service it delivers. Now, obviously, development is going to, that stage is going to take a lot of time, a lot of resources, which is the reason why you just don't do it with all the suppliers. This is one of those things that you just reserve for strategic suppliers. Once you've realized that this guy, okay, or this supplier is core, and this relationship is going to be long-term, then you can think about how can you work together so that they give us the best and you give them the best. And so you develop that supplier so that, the kind of relationship you have is a functioning one. So again, because of time, because of resources, this one, you don't do it with just about any supplier. Now, questions for you. What are the reasons for having a supplier development program, as well as what are the benefits of such program? And so to sum all that up, okay, you need to remember that the supplier relationships, the buyer-supplier relationship is not going to last forever. Yeah. And some of the ways or some of the reasons why this relationship can come to an end will include things like the contract coming to its natural end, the contract is tendered to a more capable supplier, okay, there was a breach of contract. So a breach of contract will definitely end, especially breach of a major term will definitely end the contract. And finally, the supplier becomes insolvent. So let me just quickly point out that now that we're speaking of contracts, if you're really interested in learning about contract, okay, so either for the L4M3, CIPS L4M3, or just interest in learning commercial contracting, I've added that one in the description area so you can access it. So either just contracts or contracts in procurement and supply. So check that one out. And you'll be in a position to access video lessons, practice exercise, downloadable notes, and all that stuff. So it is in the description area. So check that one out. And let's move on. So that actually marks the end of Learning Outcome 1. So what exactly was Learning Outcome 1 all about? In this case, you're supposed to differentiate between different types of commercial relationships in supply chains. Yeah, so you should be in a position to do that now based on everything that you've just covered. Now let's move on to the second learning outcome, and that is Appraise portfolio analysis techniques to assess relationships in supply chains. Now there are a number of techniques that you can use as a buyer to assess the relationships in supply chain and then end up deciding on the kind of relationship you want to have with the supplier. And in this case, we're talking about techniques like the supplier positioning, that is the Kralchik model, supplier preferencing model, as well as the market management matrix. So these are all examples. Now, all those techniques have advantages, all of them have disadvantages. So you're just going to have to decide, okay, which one makes more sense in what context, and then you're going to use it. Now, let's start with matrices to identify supply, supplier, and purchaser positioning. So you know the way you have a lot of contacts saved on your phone, but you don't have the same relationship with all of them. So the same goes when you're dealing with suppliers. A lot of suppliers, but then you don't have a relationship with all of those suppliers. That's the idea. Because of constraints like resources and time, it isn't possible to have a close relationship with each supplier. which is precisely the reason why you want to segment, okay, the product or services that you are getting, as well as the suppliers that are supplying them. So this way you can assess the company's current position and identify where it needs to make improvements in order to obtain greater value when making purchases. So the obvious result or the obvious benefit of this positioning exercise will be allowing a buyer to focus on leveraging the available resources by identifying both sourcing and relationship opportunities that may be able to add value. Number 2, identify opportunities to develop competitive advantage. 3, providing a framework for decision making and action planning for the buyer. 4, improving risk management by helping the business to identify which products and suppliers pose a vulnerability. Now, when undertaking the portfolio analysis and segmentation, you need to have a clear goal. Okay? You need to have clear goals and objectives regarding what you intend to achieve. Here are examples of 3 procurement objectives and how they can be supported by the portfolio analysis. So in this case, we are talking about things like identify opportunities to move non-contract spend on to a contract, and as a result, reduce costs. Now, in this case, the techniques that we're going to be talking about will include things like ABC analysis of top non-contract suppliers. Number 2, identify an organization's key product suppliers, and that could be achieved by using something like a Kralchik model to identify which items are strategic. And number 3, developing value-adding relationships with strategic suppliers, which could be done by reviewing where suppliers are in the supply preferencing model to assess whether more collaborative relationships are possible. So let's start with the ABC analysis. Now, the ABC analysis is actually based on the Pareto models, the 80-20 model. The idea being that 80% of stock value will be held in 20% of items commonly held as stock items. And so in this case, you end up categorizing your stock or your whatever, in this case, products, okay, into 3 categories. That is A, B, and C. Now, category A. So category A items have the smallest number of stock, usually about 20%, that will have the largest value, in this case 80%. So if you're a car manufacturer, right, so the assumption is that things like engines and maybe gearbox, so those are things that you don't have a lot of those. You probably just have like 20% of those, but then they give you 80% of the value. And then you have category B items, and in this case we're talking about 30% of your stock that contribute about 15% of your value. Okay, so in this case, or rather in the case of a car assembly, this is where you have things like body panels. Of course, it's not like if those things aren't important, they're not just as important as category A items. Okay, which means the supplier of those items, yes, they are important, but they're not as important as the people who supply category A items. And then you have category C, which in this case, you have 50% of your inventory, and yet they only contribute about 5% of your revenue. So again, low value items. And since we're using the car example, so here we could be talking about things like bolts, nuts, fasteners, etc. So from that, we can easily tell that the procurement wants to focus most of their efforts on category A items, because again, our suppliers who supply category A items, because those ones are critical. If 80% of spend is with 20% of suppliers, then obviously that's where you need to focus your relationship. So what is the downside of this analysis? Well, it kind of ignores the market complexities. That's pretty much one of the things that come out. Now, here's a question for you. What are the disadvantages of using ABC analysis in procurement? So yeah, find out that, okay? Learning by doing. Now let's move on to the second model, in this case, the Kralchik model. With the Kralchik model, we are looking to identify an organization's key products and suppliers. In this case, you are assessing your products and suppliers in terms of financial risks, okay? That is cost impact, and supply risk. And in doing so, you end up with 4 quadrants. That is routine suppliers. These are low risk, low value. So for example, stationary suppliers. Bottlenecks, okay? So again, bottleneck suppliers are high risk, low value, okay? Leverage, so in this case, you have low market risk, okay? And they provide high value, so, like product specific materials. And then you have strategic suppliers, who in this case, the relationship you have with them is, well, high risk, but then they also have a high impact. So I've added a standalone YouTube video, okay, in the description, talking about the Kralchik model. In the resource area, there is a PDF, okay, depending on which platform you're watching this from. There's a PDF summarizing all that you need to know about the Kralchik model. So let's move on. So here are practical steps in order to carry out the segmentation analysis. Number one, make a list of all purchases in descending order of value. Number two, evaluate the supply risks and market complexity for each item or service on the list. Number three, evaluate each item on the model based on the analysis of the above. Which segment of the model fits a product or service best? And four, regularly review the position of each product or service in the model to assess risk and identify new opportunities. Now, here's a question, okay? Here's a question that we need to find an answer to. What are the advantages and disadvantages of Kralchik model? Right, and so let's move on to the next one. So let's look at the supplier preferencing model. This model is going to be helpful when developing value-adding relationship with strategic suppliers. So here's the interesting part about this. You see, what we've been doing here is looking at things from a buyer's perspective. But what you have to remember is that the supplier also has their own perspective when it comes to deciding as to whether they want to work with this particular buyer or not, okay? Whether they want to deal with this buyer account. Or it's an equivalent of, like if you're running any business, okay? Let's say it's an online business. There are people who will send you email and then, they're requesting for something and then you give them details and then they don't buy. They say, I'll think about it. And then you probably run an advert or post something else. And then they also ask you about that stuff. And then you think, let me just be good. And you send them information and then they say, I'll think about it. Now, when they do that for the third time, you're like, nah, not dealing with this one anymore. So that's the same thing with suppliers, okay? They also have their own way of deciding if a buyer is good to work with or not. So the reason why we need to understand how suppliers look at, buyers is so that as buyers, we can decide, okay, or rather we can come up with things that we can do or measures that we can take to ensure that we are attractive buyers. For that supplier, the model is based on how attractive the supplier finds a buyer to be. In short, attractiveness of the account and the relative value of the business. So some of the things that will make a buyer to be attractive to the supplier will include things like profitability, opportunity to grow and develop with the buyer, stability of future contracts, as well as reputation. Of course, you can add more to that list. So let's look at that model. And in this case, okay, in the case of the preferencing model, supplier preferencing model, you're going to have 4 quadrants. So you'll have, number 1, nuisance customers who offer little profit to the supplier, and the supplier will give such less attention. And then you have exploitable customers who are less attractive but have a high value. Okay, and the supplier will maximize value from these, but on a short term. And then you have development. So these ones are attractive, but they offer low business to the supplier. So the supplier will nurture such with an aim of converting them to core customers. Of course, you have the core customers. So these ones offer high value business and are also equally attractive. So again, to avoid making this video unnecessarily long, I'm going to add a PDF in the resource area, or I've added one, so that you can just go through it and, again, avoid, having a long video. And so that's actually the end of learning outcome 2. All right. So let's move on to the next learning outcome. The third learning outcome is identify the competitive forces that impact on relationship in supply chain. Now, in any market, okay, in any market, there are going to be competitive forces, and those ones will evolve and change with time. Take something like music. So in the 90s, you had to physically buy an album And out of the 20 songs, you realize that you only like 2. But now, okay, an artist puts out an album, you go online, just listen to those 2 music, ignore the rest, okay, the 18. So that is how things are changing. Market changes will affect supply chains, particularly in terms of supplier and buyer power. So let's look at some of the competitive forces, okay, and understand their effect on supply chain. And to start, we're going to start with sources of competitive advantage. Now, competitive advantage in this case, or in this context, refers to an advantage that puts an organization in a strong position against its competitors. So if companies are not in a position to compete, if companies cannot compete, then, well, they're going to be put out of business. Meaning, companies need to ensure that they obtain a profitable and sustainable position in the market. So as we continue, it's important for you not to confuse competitive advantage with market leadership, okay? Look, just because you have a larger market share, okay, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be profitable. In fact, think of it this way. Let's say you have a YouTube channel, okay, and it has a number of subscribers. You have a lot of subscribers, and then someone else has a similar YouTube channel, okay, I mean, like in the similar niche, and they have few subscribers. So you have like 50,000 and they have 10,000. Now, it doesn't really mean that your channel is going to be more profitable than theirs, because it comes down to the strategy. What if all you're doing is producing contents and uploading them? While with them, they're not just producing content, they also have something that they're selling. So you have subscribers, they have subscribers, but their subscribers are also customers. Yours are just viewers. So you see, in this case, they're going to be making more money, depending on whether those people buy the products or not, as opposed to you. So that's the thing. Advantage, okay, differs from market leadership, or competitive advantage differs from market leadership. It all comes down to competitive strategy. And so let's talk about the competitive strategy. And so according to Michael Porter, okay, there are 2 things that are going to be looked at when you're developing, or rather when you're selecting a competitive strategy. And in this case, the attractiveness of industry for long-term profit. And number 2, factors that determine relative competitive position within an industry. And so with that, okay, according to Porter, you end up with 3 generic competitive strategies. And in this case, we have cost leadership, we also have differentiation, and we have focus. So let's look at all that. With cost leadership, in this case, you aim to be producing at a very low cost. I mean, think of it this way. Let's say you're producing a product. Which product? So any product. Let's say you're making this stuff, whatever this is, right? And you're selling it for the same price. So maybe you're selling it for 500, not that, but whatever. So you're making a product, you're selling it for $500. Your competitor is also selling it for $500, right? Let's say that's a standard price. But then it's costing you, say, 200 or 150 to produce that thing, while it's costing your competitor 300 to produce that thing. So the fact that you're producing yours at a low cost means that even if you sell it for the same price, you're going to make more profit. So in this case, your strategy is to aim at producing that thing at the lowest cost as possible. So in short, you aim to be a cost leader. That's the plan that you're going with. So how can company do this? Well, by pursuing economies of scale, by standardizing its products, or even by obtaining a proprietary technology. Again, you have to remember that it's not just about choosing one option, okay? It's about exploiting all the options that are available, okay, to you. So you just don't stick with one. If you can do 5, do all those as long as they get you to the strategy that you aim at. Now, number 2, differentiation. And in this case, you're aiming at being unique. So take something like cars, okay? Take something like cars in this case. Why would somebody decide to buy an entry-level Mercedes or BMW and then ignore a high-end Toyota, which probably costs less than that entry-level, okay, and has more features than the entry-level BMW? The reason is because of the brand, okay? So in this case, they just assume that car brand special, therefore it makes it unique. And so that's the thing. That's the brand, that's the strategy that company is going with. Due to uniqueness of product or services, the company is able to charge a premium price. Something else that you need to remember about differentiation is that it can be achieved by things like the product itself, its distribution to the marketplace, or its marketing strategies. Remember again that with differentiation, you can still focus on cost. You can still focus on reducing cost as long as doing that doesn't affect the uniqueness of your product. So it doesn't have to be like, okay, this product is unique, let's ignore cost. Not really. You can still aim at cutting the cost so that you can lead that way. But you just don't do that if you're going to sacrifice the uniqueness of your product. Now, the third one is focus. So in this case, the company chooses a segment in the marketplace and focuses its strategy on that. And this can be done in two ways. Either, number one, cost focus, where a company seeks a cost advantage on its target segment, or differentiation focus, where the company seeks to be unique in its target segment. Now let's quickly summarize how procurement objectives come into play when you're talking about these three strategies. And the first one was cost leadership. So in this case, achieve high percentage of saving, that is reduce cost, improve economies of scale, okay? Also look for opportunities to source from low-cost countries. Now regarding differentiation, source for a supplier that is able to support the unique element of the product or service. Again, regarding something like focus, source for a supplier that is able to support the needs of the niche buyers. So again, that is just a summary, okay? There are more activities there are a lot of activities that you can take as a procurement professional. Now, the thing about competitive advantage is that it's not just those three. You can still have competitive advantage through things like human resource management, okay, staff and skill, organizational culture and structure, technology, also product and intellectual properties. That's the thing. If there is any question, let me know. And let's move on. So let's talk about value chain. Value chain in this case refers to a set of activities and processes that an organization must undertake in order to create value for its customers. And this is going to help a lot with gaining competitive advantage. An organization needs to create value. That way, it can sell its products and generate profit. So this way, the stakeholders are going to be happy because, the shareholders, not stakeholders. So the shareholders are going to be happy because more profit means more dividends, means more, whatever. They're going to be happy, right? And the customers are also happy because they're getting value for what they've paid for. So it's a win-win. Porter's value chain has two parts to it. There is primary activities, which are inbound logistics, operation, outbound logistics, marketing and sales, and after-sales services. And then you have support activities. So in this case, you have farm infrastructure, human resource management, technology development, and procurement. What does all that mean, okay, in practical terms? So in this case, when analyzing your company's value chain, number one, split all activities within the company's value chain into primary and secondary, okay, activities, so primary and support activities. Review each area looking for processes that are wasteful. For example, double handling of invoices by procurement function. And three, consider linkages among the activities that are important for competitive advantage. For example, could procurement be used to reduce cost of outbound logistics? So here are some questions for you. Again, learning by doing, right? So questions. Number one, how can procurement be used to add value and generate bigger margin for organizations? And number two, think of a company of your choice and give examples of their primary and support activities in value chain. And with that, let's talk about the competitive forces and their sources. So there are 5 competitive forces that are going to affect a company's ability to make profit in a given marketplace. And so these are threat of new entrants, bargaining power of buyers, bargaining power of suppliers, threat of substitute, and rivalry among existing competitors. And let's talk about all that. Number one, rivalry among existing competitors. Now, the nature of this rivalry will, for the most part, depend on the type of market that you exist in. And this could be monopoly. If it is a pure monopoly, then you have one large supplier in the market. So it could be number 2, oligopoly. So in this case, the market is dominated by few large suppliers because the cost of entering such market is high. For instance, in oil industries. We have imperfect competition, where you have various suppliers selling various products, and then you have monopolistic and perfect competitions. That rivalry between companies in the market can be affected by a number of things, such as product difference and brand identity, okay? Switching costs from one product to another. Basically, think of it this way. So like if you're trying to switch from one product to another, let's say you are using Windows and you want to switch to Mac, okay? So what is the cost of doing that? The thing is, if the switching cost is high, then there is less competition. If the switching cost is low, then it means buyers can just jump from one product to another. And so from a company's perspective, there is high competition. And another one, exit barriers. So the next thing you need to look at is threat of new entrants, which means if it is easy for companies to just get into that market, then the competition is going to be high, okay? Because as new companies enter the market, then the competition increases. Now, some of the things that can make the entry, okay, the cost of entry to be high or low will be things like startup costs, license and permits, access to distribution networks, cost of buyers to switch from one alternative to another. And the next force is threat of substitute products. So if whatever it is that you're dealing with, okay, substitutes are available and they're actually cheaper, then obviously the competition is going to be high. So think about something like smartphones, okay? You can switch from Android to iPhone, and even as far as Androids are concerned, there are a bunch. Samsung, Huawei, Tecno, all that stuff. So you can just switch from one to the other, okay? Of course, the cost is going to be a factor, but there is a substitute. So there are various factors that affect substitution. So in this case, price of the substitute, switching cost, okay? Buyers' propensity to substitutes, and how they evaluate the economic benefit. Now, here's a question for you. Set the factors that will affect the bargaining power of a buyer and those that will affect the bargaining power of a supplier. So yeah, I mean, remember, those are two other, forces, okay, competitive forces in the market. Right, so at what point is the buyer strong? At what point is the supplier strong? For example, if there are many buyers in the market, who does that favor? If there are few or many suppliers in the market, who is that favoring? So think about things like that. And that actually is the end of learning outcome 3. Anyway, if you have any question, ask. Let's move on. Learning outcome 4 requires you to compare the source of added value that can be achieved through supply chain relationships. So there are a number of ways that procurement can add value, okay, through the decision it makes when it comes to sourcing. Sources of added value can include things like pricing and cost management, improving quality, and timescales, etc. Now, before we jump into the sources of added value, you just need to remember the following things about value chain. An organization will add value to its inputs in order to create value for the customer. These will generate margin or profit for the company. The activities in the value chain are interdependent, okay? What affects one will affect the other, and waste across the value chain should be eliminated. Now, when it comes to sources of added value, you have to remember that they just link to the 5 rights of procurement. In this case, we're talking about the right quantity, the right quality, the right time, the right place, and the right price. So let's look at all these added value sources, and you're going to start with pricing and cost management. Now, achieving reduced cost for inputs and generating saving is traditionally what the procurement department has been associated with. How does procurement go about doing this? And there are a number of things they can do. For example, reducing the unit cost paid for product or service. Number 2, getting additional product or service for the same price, in this case, value adds. Number 3, increasing the payment terms, for instance, moving from 30 days to 60 days. You see, the thing is, if you negotiate and the supplier says, okay, it's net 30, that means you need to pay after 30 days, right? But if you can extend that and tell them, okay, how about you pay after 60 days? That means you have 30 days to do something with the money that you could have given, okay, after day number 30. So now you'll give it up after day number 60, okay? So you have 30 days to do something with that money. So that is a good thing. And number 4, well, it is a good thing if you know what to do with the money anyway. So number 4, mitigating a price increase that supplier requests. And the other thing here is specification development. So by working with the user department and internal stakeholders, specification development is a good way procurement can use to manage the cost of inputs. And if they're doing these, some of the elements that the procurement will have to consider will include things like ensuring that the user department has not over-specified the requirements, okay? Making sure that the specification is clear and unambiguous, that prices are not being overinflated due to uncertainty. And number 3, ensuring that all spend within supplier is captured in a proper contract. Number 4, reviewing whether any products could be substituted for non-branded alternatives. And then the other way that supplier can help is through improving quality. There are 2 elements when considering the quality of products and services. And the first one is whether they are fit for purpose. And number 2, whether the products or service meet specifications. Now, when it comes to specifications, there are 2 things you need to understand, okay? Specifications can be conformance, in which case you require the supplier to stick to what you've just told them. So, for example, if you're dealing with engineering and stuff like that, so I give you the specification and that is what I want you to stick with. And then you have performance, where I describe what I want, okay? And then you come up with whatever solves whatever it is that I want. So in this case, the supplier is free to be creative. Of course, you know, there are advantages to both, okay? So it will just depend on the context, or rather the circumstance that you are working with, okay? Or you are in. Here is a question. Give an example of when to use conformance specification and when to use performance specification. And quite frankly, I've just answered that. Anyway, so poor quality, okay? If you ignore quality, so poor quality will come at a cost. And this cost will include things like cost of the organization undertaking rework to product that may include faulty components, cost of downtime, of course, the reputation cost also to the organization. So when it comes to quality, again, as a procurement, you want to ensure that the right suppliers are on board. And that will mean assessing the suppliers in terms of things like selection of suppliers that can provide good quality product or service, appraising the supplier's quality policy, and whether or not supplier has externally accredited quality standards such as ISO 9001, checking how the supplier manages quality on its own supply chain. So here's a question for you. What is the difference between quality control and quality assurance? Quality control versus quality assurance. Let's move on. And now let's talk about timescales. On-time delivery is a key part of ensuring that the business and manufacturing process are able to remain operational. And that is just common sense, okay? Things need to be delivered on time, because otherwise you get production bottlenecks or stoppage, which could have a number of negative effects, okay? The company ends up disappointing its customers. This is why lead time, something like a lead time, is very important. And when it comes to lead time, then the question becomes, what are some of the things that we can do to shorten the lead time? And some of the things you can do will include paying higher prices for shorter delivery time. Of course, you also have to look at the cost benefits of doing that. So just because somebody says you can deliver in 5 days, but if you increase your price by this much, then you can deliver in 2 days, you just don't say, okay, yeah, deliver in 2 days, I'll pay more. You have to look at the cost benefit analysis. Now, number 2, simplifying transaction process such as time taken to convert a purchase requisition to a purchase order. And number 3, working with suppliers to reduce waste in the cycle of ordering, such as delays caused by double handling on the supplier side. And then we have quantities, which is also another way that procurement can help in value adding, okay? And you need to ensure that the suppliers provide the right quantity, okay, of whatever it is that you're into, okay, or whatever it is that you've ordered. With quantities, you have to be really good at inventory management. And it is important for you to remember that there is a cost, okay? There is a cost associated with holding stock. That's just a thing, okay? Some of those things that you study at whole life asset management. So there is a cost associated with that. The more stock you have, it's not always a good thing. Even though sometimes you might gain advantage from doing that. Ensuring the right quantity of goods is received by the organization also include stocking and store management policies. Let's talk about the benefits. So what are the benefits? Okay, what are the benefits associated with holding stock? And some of these benefits will include: it ensures continuity of supply. If unforeseen events occur, it can reduce long lead times, ensuring production can continue on short term. Potential discounts may be available if you buy in bulk. But then again, just because somebody says, if you buy more, I'm going to give you a discount, doesn't really mean that you buy more, right? You need to look at the cost. Okay, so yes, I can buy more, but what is the cost associated with holding more of these stock? So that's something you need to think about. And another one, it protects against price fluctuations. But then you have a number of costs. As we mentioned earlier, you have a number of costs associated with having more quantities. And these will include things like the cost of storage, the cost of capital tied up in stock, risk of obsolescence depending on the product. And so what you're simply saying is that you need to remember that holding stock, yes, can reduce risks, but it can also increase costs. Right, and so there you go. These are some of the things that you need to know. Now, to conclude everything that we've just summed up here, this was part 1 of CIPS Level 4, Module 6, that is supplier relationships. And in this part, you are supposed to understand the dynamics of relationships in supply chains. And there are 4 learning outcomes, okay? There are 4 learning outcomes, and they required you to be in a position to differentiate between different types of commercial relationships in supply chain, appraise portfolio analysis techniques to assess relationship in supply chains, identify the competitive forces that impact on relationships in supply chain, and then compare the sources of added value that can be achieved through supply chain relationships. And so I'm going to do part 2 of these, okay, and put it in the video description if it isn't there right now, which means if it is not there, subscribe so that if you put it up, you can be notified. If there is any question, do let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.